The diamond on Nia's finger didn't sparkle, it trembled. Standing at the altar of St. Jude's Cathedral, surrounded by 300 of New York's most dangerous elites, she wasn't a bride. She was a payment. A sacrifice to keep the monster standing beside her, Victor Thorne, from burning her world to ash. The priest asked the question. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Nia opened her mouth to speak the lie, to say, "I do," but the words never came. Because the massive oak doors at the back of the cathedral didn't just open, they exploded. Wood splintered, flying like shrapnel. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room as the warm, golden candlelight was sliced apart by a shaft of cold, blue daylight. The organ music died instantly. In the settling dust, a silhouette stood framed by the wreckage. It wasn't a guest. It wasn't a savior. It was the devil himself. Kang Jinwoo. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was dressed for war, a black tactical suit, the collar torn open, sweat glistening on the hard cord of his neck. He didn't look like a man who had come to object. He looked like a man who had come to slaughter. In his right hand, he gripped a stained wooden baseball bat. He stepped forward and the sound scraped against the stone floor. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Nia's heart stopped. Tears froze on her cheeks as she whispered the name she had promised never to speak again. Jin. Beside her, Victor Thorne didn't let go. He dug his fingers into her arm, bruising the skin through the delicate lace, a sneer curling his lip. "Security!" he barked, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. Jinwoo didn't run. He didn't shout. He just walked down the center aisle, the bat dragging behind him like a judgment. He ignored the armed guards rising from the pews. He stopped 10 feet from the altar, his dark eyes locking onto Nia's, ignoring everyone else in the room. The silence was deafening until he spoke, his voice low and lethal. "I told you, Nia," he said, shifting his grip on the bat. "Death is the only thing that separates us, and I'm not dead yet. Get this filth out of here." Victor Thorne roared, his voice cracking with a desperation that didn't match his expensive suit. 2 of his largest enforcers lunged from the front pew, reaching for their holsters. They were fast, but Jinwoo was inevitable. He didn't even break stride. He swung the bat with a compact, vicious efficiency. The first blow caught the lead guard in the knee, a sickening crunch that echoed off the vaulted ceiling like a thunderclap. As the man screamed, Jinwoo pivoted, driving the wood into the second guard's jaw. Blood sprayed across the white lilies lining the aisle. It was ugly. Raw violence in the house of God, and the congregation sat frozen in horrific fascination. It was over in 3 seconds. Jinwoo stepped over the groaning bodies, his breathing even, and began to ascend the marble steps of the altar. Thorne scrambled back, dragging Nia with him. With a trembling hand, he ripped a silver pistol from his waistband and jammed the cold barrel against Nia's temple. "Take one more step, and I paint the altar with her." Jinwoo stopped. The bat clattered to the floor, rolling away. He stood empty-handed, looking at the gun pressed to the woman he loved with eyes that held zero fear, only bored, freezing contempt. "Go ahead," Jinwoo said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Shoot her, do it, and I will hunt down every person who shares your last name. I will burn your lineage until history forgets you ever existed." He took a slow step forward. "Or give her to me and you live for another hour." Thorne hesitated, the barrel shaking against Nia's skin. He was weighing his greed against his survival, but Nia saw the opening. With a sharp cry, she drove her heel down hard onto Thorne's instep. Thorne howled, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. That was all Jinwoo needed. He lunged like a viper. Thorne panicked and squeezed the trigger. A deafening bang rang out and the world went black. The gunshot was already a fading echo, replaced by the aggressive roar of a V8 engine tearing down the highway. Rain lashed against the tinted windows, sealing them inside a capsule of black leather and cold fury. Nia sat in the passenger seat, shaking uncontrollably. Her extravagant white wedding dress was ruined, the hem soaked in mud and smeared with the bright red blood of the guard Jinwoo had destroyed back at the altar. Jinwoo was driving like a madman, weaving through traffic with lethal precision. His left hand white-knuckled the steering wheel, his right hand gripped Nia's thigh. His fingers dug into her flesh through the silk, holding her down, not in passion, but in absolute, terrifying possession. He hadn't spoken a word since he dragged her out of the church, but the silence was loud. He was vibrating with a rage so potent it made the air in the car feel thin. He didn't know. He couldn't know. Nia stared at his sharp profile, fighting back fresh tears. Thorne had cornered her 3 days ago. He had photos of Jinwoo's little sister walking into her private school. Marry me, or the school burns with her inside. That was the ultimatum. She hadn't betrayed Jinwoo. She had thrown herself on a grenade to save the only family he had left. I had to, she whispered, the confession barely audible over the rain. He threatened Soyeon. I did it for you, Jin. The car shrieked as Jinwoo slammed on the brakes. The sedan skidded across the wet asphalt, fishtailing before coming to a violent halt in the middle of the road. Jinwoo turned on her, and the wildness in his eyes made her press her spine against the door. You don't get to decide when I need saving, he hissed, the words dripping with venom. You insulted me, Nia. You looked at me and thought I was too weak to handle a cockroach like Thorne. You thought you had to sell yourself to protect my blood. He shifted gears, stomping on the gas so hard her head snapped back against the seat. Now you pay the price, he growled, staring straight ahead into the storm. You wanted to be a wife so badly? Fine, you're coming home. The elevator ride up was a suffocating vacuum of silence. When the doors slid open, the air changed instantly. Jinwoo's penthouse wasn't a home. It was a fortress of glass, steel, and aggressive minimalism. It was the polar opposite of the warm, deceptive candlelight of the cathedral. Here, high above the city, there were no shadows to hide in. He didn't shove her. He guided her with a terrifyingly controlled grip on her elbow, marching her past the sprawling view of Manhattan and straight to the master bedroom. He pushed her inside, not violent, just final, and pulled the door shut. The heavy, mechanical click of the lock sliding into place from the outside hit her like a physical blow. Nia stood in the center of the vast, gray room, the silence pressing in on her eardrums. A cold realization washed over her. She hadn't escaped. She had simply traded a butcher for a jailer. Victor Thorne had wanted a trophy to display on a shelf. Jinwoo wanted a possession to lock in a vault. She caught her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window, the wedding dress. It looked grotesque now, a suffocating blood-stained costume of a bride she never wanted to be. Panic flared in her chest. She clawed at the bodice, twisting her body to find the zipper, but her trembling fingers fumbled. It was stuck. She tugged harder, gasping for air, scratching her own skin in a desperate need to get the thing off, until she finally collapsed onto the plush rug, sobbing in frustration. Suddenly, the lock clicked again. Nia scrambled backward across the floor, pressing herself against the bed frame, her breath catching in her throat. Jinwoo filled the doorway. In his hand, a silver knife caught the harsh overhead light. He didn't speak. He walked toward her, ignoring her flinch, his face unreadable. He reached down, spun her around with one hand, and before she could scream, he brought the knife down. Arararip. With surgical precision, he sliced the dress from the neckline to the waist. The tension released instantly, and the heavy silk pooled on the floor around her ankles. He stepped back, looking down at the ruined pile of white lace with dark, possessive eyes. Burn it, he commanded. You never wear white again. The silk lay in a ruined heap on the floor. Nia, shivering, grabbed one of Jinwoo's black dress shirts from the bed. She pulled it on, the fabric swallowing her small frame, but as she buttoned it, the sleeve slid up her arm. There it was, 5 ugly, purple finger marks branded into her bicep, a map of violence left by Victor Thorne's grip at the altar. Jinwoo froze. The air in the room shifted instantly. The wild, chaotic heat of his anger evaporated, replaced by a stillness that was infinitely more terrifying. The monster was gone. The caretaker had arrived. He walked into the ensuite bathroom and returned a moment later with a cool, damp cloth. He reached out, his fingers, the same ones that had shattered a man's jaw minutes ago, brushing her skin with the lightness of a ghost. He dabbed the bruise gently, cleaning away the sweat and grime. Then, slowly, he leaned down and pressed his lips against the purple skin. It wasn't a kiss of affection, it was a reclaiming. He was worshipping the pain because it was on his property. He touched you, Jinwoo murmured against her skin. It wasn't a question, it was a death sentence. He straightened up, his eyes suddenly empty of humanity. He began buttoning his cuffs with slow, deliberate movements. I was going to let him live for another hour. I changed my mind. He turned and walked out the door without looking back. Nia scrambled to the floor-to-ceiling window, her breath fogging the glass. Below, in the pouring rain, the garage gates opened. A convoy of 6 black SUVs rolled out like a funeral procession, tearing onto the street. He wasn't just leaving. He was going to war. Nia watched the red taillights of the convoy fade into the rainy night, her breath fogging the glass. She thought she was alone. She thought he had left her to burn the city down. But the silence of the penthouse was shattered by a concussion that knocked her off her feet. Boom. The floor lurched. Emergency alarms began to wail, a high-pitched scream that tore through the luxury suite. Before Nia could scramble up, the massive window she had just been standing in exploded inward. Shards of safety glass rained down like diamonds. 2 men in tactical gear swung in on rappel lines, their boots crunching on the debris. Victor Thorne hadn't waited to be hunted. He had come to the lion's den. Nia screamed, scrambling backward, but the first mercenary was too fast. He lunged, his gloved hand tangling in her hair, yanking her head back with a brutal jerk. "Target acquired," he yelled into his comms. "Let her go." The voice didn't come from the elevator. It came from the shadows of the hallway. Jinwoo stepped out. He hadn't left. The convoy was a ghost, the penthouse was the trap. He was unarmed, but he didn't need a weapon. He was the weapon. He moved with a blur of violence, tackling the mercenary holding Nia. The sound of snapping bone was louder than the alarms. He drove the man's head into the floor, then spun to face the second intruder who pulled a combat knife. It was a dance of pure brutality. Jinwoo didn't dodge, he intercepted. He caught the knife hand, twisting it until the wrist snapped, then drove his elbow into the man's throat. The last mercenary fell, choking on his own blood. Silence returned, heavy and thick. Jinwoo turned to Nia, his chest heaving, his eyes searching her face for damage. "Are you hurt?" he rasped. But before she could answer, his knees buckled. He stumbled back against the wall, his hand pressing to his side. Thick, dark blood began to bloom across his white shirt, soaking the fabric. He slid down the wall, leaving a bright red streak on the pristine paint. "Jin!" Nia screamed, rushing to catch him before he hit the floor. "Hush!" Nia whispered, her hands shaking as she drove the curved needle through his skin. Jinwoo sat on the edge of the bed, his tactical vest and shirt discarded on the blood-soaked rug. The intricate ink of a roaring black dragon coiled around his torso, its scales now bisected by the angry red gash and Nia's clumsy stitching. He didn't flinch at the needle. He just watched her, his eyes glassy with fever and adrenaline. "I knew," he rasped, his voice rough. He caught her wrist, stopping the needle. "Thorne's threat, the school. I had a team on Soyeon 24/7. She was never in danger, Nia." Nia froze. The needle slipped from her fingers. The wedding, the terror, the altar. It had all been a game she didn't know the rules to. "You knew, then why?" "Because I needed to know if you would do it," Jinwoo admitted, leaning his forehead against hers, his defenses crumbling under the weight of the pain. "But you broke me, Nia, seeing you in that dress, walking down that aisle toward him. It hurt more than this knife ever could." Tears spilled over Nia's lashes. She cupped his face, her thumb brushing against his high cheekbone, smearing a trace of his own blood on his skin. "I didn't care about the truth," she whispered brokenly. "I wanted you alive more than I wanted to be free." Jinwoo groaned, a sound of pure defeat, and pulled her down. Their mouths met in a desperate, bruising kiss that tasted of iron, salt, and survival. It was a promise sealed in blood. But the moment shattered. The phone on the nightstand buzzed, vibrating violently against the glass surface. They pulled apart, breathless. Jinwoo stared at the screen. The caller ID read, "Unknown." He tapped the speaker. "You're good, Jinwoo," Thorne's voice crackled through the room, breathless and manic. "But you pulled your team to protect the penthouse." "Check the school again. I have her." "Bring her to Pier 4, Thorne spat, his voice distorted by static and malice. "You have 30 minutes. If I don't see the bitch who broke my foot, your sister comes back to you in pieces." The line went dead. Jinwoo tossed the phone onto the bloody sheets. He stood up, swaying slightly, the fresh stitches pulling tight against his skin. His face was a mask of cold calculation. He grabbed a fresh magazine for his pistol and turned to the bedroom door, his hand already reaching for the lock. "You stay here. I'll handle it." "No." The word stopped him. He turned to find Nia standing by the nightstand. In her hands, heavy and awkward but steady, was his backup Sig Sauer. Her knuckles were white, but her eyes were dry. "I'm not trading you, Nia," Jinwoo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "I will burn this city to the ground before I hand you over to him." "He doesn't want me," Nia countered, stepping closer. "He wants you dead. If you go alone, you die. I started this by walking down that aisle. I'm going to finish it." She racked the slide, the sharp metal clack echoing in the room like a gavel strike. Jinwoo stared at her. For the first time, he didn't see a victim or a prize. He saw a queen, a woman worthy of the throne he sat on. He didn't argue. He didn't try to take the gun. He simply nodded, a dark respect burning in his gaze. "Stay behind me," he commanded. The Brooklyn docks were a graveyard of rusted metal and fog. The heavy mist rolled off the black water, swirling around the towering shipping containers like ghosts. Jinwoo killed the headlights of the stolen sedan, rolling to a silent stop. 50 yards away, bathed in the harsh glare of halogen floodlights, stood Victor Thorne. He was smiling. And kneeling in the wet gravel before him, a gun pressed hard against her temple, was a terrifyingly small figure in a school uniform. Soyeon. "Let her go," Jinwoo called out, his voice echoing off the shipping containers. He stood tall, the blood from his side staining his shirt, but his aim on Thorne was steady. Thorne pressed the muzzle harder into Soyeon's trembling cheek, grinning like a shark. "You really don't get it, do you? I didn't want a wife, Jin. I wanted your crown. And you just walked right into the abdication ceremony." Jinwoo took a step forward, but he froze. A familiar, cold circle of steel pressed into the base of his spine. "Don't move, boss." It was Kai, his most trusted lieutenant, the man who had stood beside him at his father's funeral. Jinwoo didn't turn, his eyes went dead. "Kai." "Checkmate," Thorne laughed, the sound sharp and cruel in the damp air. "You were so busy looking at her, you forgot to watch your back. Love made you weak, Jinwoo." Nia screamed, raising her own shaking gun, but she was out of range. Thorne leveled his pistol. He wasn't aiming at Soyeon anymore. He was aiming directly at the group. Bang! The gunshot tore through the mist. Nia squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for Jinwoo to fall. But he didn't. Behind him, Kai grunted, a wet, shocked sound, and crumpled to the wet gravel, a hole in the center of his forehead. Thorne lowered his smoking gun, his face twisted in pure, manic arrogance. He sneered at the dead traitor. "I don't share my kills," he spat, "and I don't need help putting a dog down. He's mine." It was pure ego, a fatal mistake born of pride. The confusion hung in the air for exactly 1 second. Jinwoo didn't waste it. He dropped to a crouch, his roar tearing through the shock. "Run!" He shoved Nia toward a stack of rusted crates, just as Thorne opened fire again, the bullets sparking wildly off the pavement where they had just been standing. The shipping yard became a labyrinth of rusted steel and death. Nia scrambled through the narrow gaps between the towering containers, her breath burning like fire in her lungs. Behind her, the heavy crunch of boots on gravel grew louder. Victor Thorne wasn't running anymore. He was stalking. She turned a sharp corner and skidded to a halt. The dark, oily water of the harbor lapped against the concrete edge. A dead end. "Found you." Nia spun around. Thorne stepped out of the mist, his suit torn, his eyes manic. He raised his gun, leveling it at her chest. "You ruined everything," he spat, stepping closer, cornering her against the freezing drop. "I was going to be the king of this city, and you're just the whore who broke the crown." He cocked the hammer. "If I can't have it, no one gets to keep the queen." He tightened his finger on the trigger. But the shot never came. A shadow detached itself from the top of the container directly above Thorn. Jinwoo dropped like a judgment from the sky, landing on Thorn with the weight of a collapsing building. Thorn's gun skittered across the concrete. Jinwoo didn't say a word. He didn't monologue. He stood up, and in his hand, dragged from the wreckage of their escape vehicle, was the wooden baseball bat. The first swing broke Thorn's arm. The scream was cut short by the second swing to the ribs. Crack. It was primal, ugly, circular justice. The same sound that had started the war in the church now ended it on the docks. Jinwoo hit him again, and again, venting every ounce of fear he had felt when the gun was at Soyun's head. He didn't stop until Thorn was a broken, gasping heap, dragging himself uselessly through the mud. Jinwoo tossed the splintered bat into the water. He pulled the pistol from his waistband and walked over to Nia. He didn't hug her. He pressed the warm metal of the gun into her trembling palm and looked down at the man who had tried to own her. "His fate is yours," Jinwoo said, his voice void of mercy. "Do it." The gun was heavy in her hand, the steel warm from Jinwoo's grip. Nia looked down at Victor Thorn. The man who had terrorized her, who had bruised her skin and threatened a child, was now just a broken, wheezing mess in the dirt. He looked up at her, waiting for the flash, waiting to be made a martyr by the woman he tried to own. Nia lowered her arm. Her fingers opened. The gun hit the concrete with a dull thud, the sound echoing in the silence. "He's not worth the noise," she said, her voice steady. Jinwoo looked at her, and a dark, terrifying pride flared in his eyes. He nodded once. Then, without a word, he turned to Thorn. He didn't offer a final prayer. He simply raised his boot and shoved. Thorn slid off the edge of the dock. There was no scream, just a heavy splash into the freezing black harbor, swallowed instantly by the tide. Silence returned to the docks. Slowly, the gray light of dawn began to bleed through the mist, illuminating the blood on their clothes and the exhaustion in their bones. Jinwoo reached out, taking her bloody hand in his. They didn't speak of going back to normal. Normal was gone. The white dress was burned, the altar was smashed. She wasn't an innocent bystander anymore. She was his. 1 month later. The city sprawled below the penthouse window, alive with lights. Inside, the office was quiet. Jinwoo sat at his mahogany desk, reviewing territory maps. Across the room, Nia wasn't cowering. She was painting, a canvas filled with violent, beautiful strokes of red and gold. Jinwoo stood and walked over to her. He didn't speak. He simply took her left hand, lifting it to the light. The diamond engagement ring was gone. In its place sat a simple, thick band of black obsidian. He pressed a kiss to the ring, his eyes locking with hers in the reflection of the glass. "I burned the world to keep you," he whispered against her skin, "and I'd do it again. If you love a man who would destroy the world just to hear you breathe, hit that like button and subscribe."